Bergen, 1650. The harbour smells of dried fish and pine resin. German merchants in heavy wool coats walk the wharves of Briggen, the long row of painted wooden warehouses that has defined this city's waterfront since the 14th century. At the end of the wharf, past the Hanseatic counting houses, stands a different kind of building. A stone manor house, its windows facing the bay, its cellar stocked with silver plate, imported wine, and salted herring. The family who lives there is not German, they are Norwegian. And in a country that has been governed from Copenhagen for over a century, the way they got rich and the way they hold on to it tells the entire story of power in Danish-ruled Norway. When Denmark absorbed Norway in 1537, it dismantled the Norwegian institutions that might have anchored a native ruling class. The Catholic Church, which had owned roughly 40% of Norway's productive land, was dissolved. Those lands passed to the Danish crown. The Norwegian Council of State, the body through which Norwegian nobles had exercised political influence, was abolished. The Lutheran Church replaced the Catholic one, and its bishops were appointed by Copenhagen. What remained was the land, the forests, the fisheries, and the sea routes. And the Norwegians who learned to operate within Danish structures while building wealth from those natural resources became, over the next 2 centuries, the most powerful people in the country. The first tier of this elite was the old Norwegian nobility. What survived of it? The Black Death of 1349 had annihilated between 40% and 60% of Norway's population and struck the aristocracy with particular force. Noble families depended on agricultural rents from tenant farmers, and when those farmers died by the hundreds of thousands, the income that sustained noble households collapsed. Some families recovered. Others vanished entirely within a generation. By the time of the Reformation, the Norwegian nobility had shrunk from roughly 800 families to approximately 400, and most of those were of mixed Norwegian and Danish descent. Under Danish rule, the formal nobility of Norway became progressively more Danish. The senior administrative positions, the lensmen who governed Norway's counties, the commanders of the great fortresses at Akershus in Oslo and Bergenhus in Bergen, were filled by Danish appointees sent from Copenhagen. Norwegian noblemen could serve in these roles, but they competed against Danish candidates for every significant post. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue. The Bjelke family navigated this system with exceptional skill across 3 generations. Jens Bjelke, who served as Chancellor of Norway from 1614 to 1659, was the most powerful native-born Norwegian of his era. He managed the country's legal administration for 4 decades while simultaneously building one of the largest private estates in Norwegian history. His manor at Austrat, on the Trondheim fjord, was, by Norwegian standards, a statement of power comparable to the great English country houses of the same period. The Bjelke family's wealth rested on a combination of crown offices, direct land ownership, and the timber trade that was transforming Norway's economy. That timber trade was the economic engine of Norwegian elite life in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it created a second tier of powerful families. Men who held no noble titles, but whose wealth exceeded that of most titled lords. The water-powered sawmill arrived in Norway's fjord valleys in the early 16th century. Before the sawmill, Norway's vast forests were largely inaccessible commercial resources. The labour required to cut logs into boards by hand made large-scale timber export economically marginal. The sawmill changed everything. By the mid-16th century, mills were operating on the rivers of Telemark, Ostfold, and the Oslofjord region, and the Dutch market was consuming Norwegian boards as fast as they could be produced. The men who owned the mills and the forests were Norwegian, and the surplus they retained from selling logs to Dutch factors made some of them extraordinarily rich. By the late 16th century, a new class of Norwegian merchant industrialists had emerged in the eastern valleys and around the Oslofjord. Men whose estates were measured not in acres of farmland, but in numbers of sawmill wheels turning in the spring flood rivers. These men operated within the Danish mercantilist system, not against it. The Danish crown needed timber revenue and was willing to grant monopoly rights on sawmill operation to individuals who could deliver reliable production. A successful sawmill operator in Ostfold might spend a generation building up millage rights, buying forest tracts from cash-strapped noble families, and marrying their daughters to the sons of Danish officials who could smooth regulatory questions at the Copenhagen court. After 1661, when King Frederick III introduced absolute monarchy in Denmark-Norway, the crown began systematically ennobling wealthy merchants and officials in exchange for financial contributions to the royal treasury. Letters of nobility could be purchased. This created a new Norwegian elite, not the old sword nobility whose privileges dated to the medieval period, but a money nobility whose status was fresh, whose connections to Copenhagen were transactional, and whose power rested on commerce rather than hereditary land tenure. The copper mines at Røros opened in 1644, and the silver mines at Kongsberg, discovered in 1623, added another dimension to this merchant elite. Mine operators, and the merchants who supplied them with food, tools, and transport, were tied into royal concession systems that made individual fortunes quickly, but also made those fortunes dependent on continued royal favour. A mine manager at Kongsberg lived in a company town, operated on a royal licence, and answered ultimately to the superintendent appointed by the Danish king. But within those constraints, he could accumulate considerable personal wealth. Bergen remained the largest city in Norway throughout this period and the centre of its most concentrated wealth. The Hanseatic trading post at Bryggen had dominated Bergen's commerce since the mid-14th century, giving German merchants from Lübeck, Hamburg, and Bremen monopoly rights over the stockfish trade. Norwegian fishermen from the Lofoten Islands brought their dried cod to Bergen in the spring, and the German merchants set the prices, controlled the transport, and captured most of the profit. But by the mid-16th century, the Hanseatic League's grip on Bergen was weakening. The Danish-Norwegian crown began curtailing Hanseatic privileges. German merchants at Bryggen were required to accept Norwegian legal jurisdiction. Restrictions were placed on their ability to deal directly with Norwegian farmers and fishermen, forcing trade through Norwegian burgher intermediaries. The Norwegian merchants who filled the vacuum left by the declining Hanseatic monopoly became Bergen's new patriciate, a tight network of families, mostly with origins in Germany or the Netherlands, but by the 17th century deeply rooted in Bergen through generations of intermarriage and property accumulation. These families controlled the flow of dried fish southward to Catholic markets in Portugal, Spain, and the Mediterranean, and the flow of grain, cloth, salt, and luxury goods northward to Norwegian consumers. A Bergen merchant of significant standing in 1650 lived in a world of calculated display. His house was built of stone. In a country where most people lived in wood frame or log structures, a stone house was a statement that required no explanation. The interior featured Dutch glazed tiles, imported Flemish paintings, and silver candlesticks. His table offered wine from the Rhine, smoked meats, imported spices, and fresh fish from the harbour market. He spoke Norwegian to his servants, Danish to his officials, German to his Hanseatic contacts, and Dutch to his trading partners in Amsterdam. This linguistic fluency was a professional requirement. The most successful Bergen merchants were those who could navigate all four language communities simultaneously. Women in these households occupied a position that was more active than their formal invisibility in legal documents might suggest. Merchant widows routinely ran their late husbands' trading businesses. In a world where commercial knowledge was accumulated over decades and resided in the family as much as in any individual, it was economically irrational to hand a business to an outsider simply because the patriarch had died. The records of Bergen's commercial courts include case after case in which a merchant's widow is conducting negotiations, disputing contracts, and managing loans years after her husband's death. The social circuit of this elite ran from Bergen to Copenhagen and back. Marriages were arranged between Bergen merchant families and Danish official families to create connections that served both commercial and political purposes. Sons were sent to the University of Copenhagen to study law, and many returned to Norway in administrative positions that served both their families' interests and the Danish crown's need for locally knowledgeable officials. The wealth that accumulated in these merchant and official households was the material foundation of Norwegian identity under Danish rule. It funded the education of the men who, in 1799, founded the Society for Norway's Welfare, the first organized expression of a distinctly Norwegian national interest. It sustained the network of civil servants and timber merchants who, when the Treaty of Kiel handed Norway to Sweden in January 1814, had both the political sophistication and the economic independence to say no. Without the timber money, the Bergen trading houses, and the mine concessions of the Danish period, there would have been no class of Norwegians capable of sitting down at Eidsvoll in April 1814 and writing a constitution in 5 weeks. Power under Danish rule was constrained and often humiliating, but it was real, and it outlasted the Danes. The physical domestic world of the Norwegian elite in the 17th century was built to communicate status at every scale. The great manor houses of the Bjelke family and their peers were, by Norwegian standards, substantial stone structures with multiple floors, large reception rooms, and formal gardens of the kind that Dutch and Danish architectural fashion had made fashionable across northern Europe. But Norway was not a country of palaces. The country's mountainous terrain, dispersed population, and timber-based building culture meant that even the wealthiest Norwegian landowners lived in structures that a Danish or German noble of equivalent wealth would have considered modest. What distinguished elite Norwegian domestic life was not architectural grandeur, but the density and quality of portable wealth, silver tableware, woven tapestries, imported ceramics, and the books that began appearing in Norwegian manor house libraries as the 17th century progressed. The church played a specific role in Norwegian elite society that differed subtly from its role in Denmark or Germany. In a country with no university until the 19th century, Norwegian students had to travel to Copenhagen for higher education. The Lutheran clergy were the primary educated professionals available outside the capital. The bishops of the Norwegian dioceses, the senior clergy of the cathedral chapters in Trondheim, Bergen, Oslo, and Stavanger, were simultaneously religious leaders and administrators of an educational system, legal system, and social welfare network that had no secular equivalent in rural Norway. A bishop of Trondheim in the 17th century was one of the most powerful men in northern Norway, not because of military force, but because he controlled the recording of births and deaths, the certification of marriages, the education of children, and the distribution of poor relief in a territory the size of a small European kingdom. Norwegian elite families that could not send their sons to Copenhagen for legal training often directed them toward the church as the alternative path to literacy, professional standing, and social influence. The result was a clergy in Norway that was, through the 17th and 18th centuries, increasingly drawn from the same families that produced the country's timber merchants and local officials. The pastor of a rural Norwegian parish was frequently the son of a sawmill owner, the brother-in-law of a county administrator, and the cousin of a Bergen merchant. These overlapping networks of family, commerce, and institutional authority created the connective tissue of Norwegian society under Danish rule, a web of relationships that persisted through generations and gave the country a degree of informal self-organization that its formal subordination to Copenhagen did not reflect. It was precisely this class, educated, connected, economically independent, and increasingly aware of Norwegian distinctiveness within the Danish framework, that produced the men who travelled to Eidsvoll in April 1814. The delegates who wrote the Norwegian constitution were not revolutionaries in the French sense. They were the representatives of the established provincial elite of a country that had been governing itself informally for 2 centuries, while being governed formally from Copenhagen. When the opportunity arose to formalize what already existed, they seized it with a speed and confidence that reflected not improvisation but preparation. The accumulated social and intellectual capital of generations of men who had learned to run a country while pretending to be administered from abroad.